Hello, welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. Today's actually a very unique episode because with me today I've got Jacob Zumoff. Jacob is a historian and author. He's written books on the Communist Party of the USA as well as on the Passaic Strike. And he is a research associate at the Prometheus Research Library, or the PRL, which is what we want to talk about. So, welcome, Jacob.
Hi, thank you.
So, why don't we start by talking a little bit about what the PRL is and why it's important?
Okay, great. Yes, the PRL, we're a working Marxist archive in New York City. We have a great collection of material on the history of Marxism, the labor movement here in the United States, but also internationally. We are originated as kind of the personal collection of James Robertson, who was the founder of the Revolutionary Tendency, and then later on the leader of the Spartacist League and the International Communist League. And so we developed out of his personal collection, and then it became the reference library for the Central Committee of the Spartacist League and the International Communist League. So we have a large amount of material that documents the history of the labor movement, the Marxist left, and especially the Trotskyist movement here in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere.
2 floors full, as I understand it.
2 floors,
Yes,
yes,
okay.
which in Manhattan is a premium.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Now, before we start getting into some of the collections, so of course, developed, at different stages. How long has the PRL been around for?
In one form or another, since the 1970s.
Okay, it's quite old. Is this something that's been put to use by researchers, people who work on the history of the labor movement, the Marxist movement, etc.? What kind of ways has it been able to achieve its?
One of our goals is to foster collaboration among people, historians, activists, others who are interested in the history of the left. So some of the things that we do is we encourage people to come and look at our materials. I mean, a basic example is myself. When I wrote my 2 books, I used a lot of the materials we have here, but people not affiliated with the library. For example, the Canadian historian Brian Palmer recently published over several years, but a 2-volume ongoing biography of James P. Cannon, the historic leader of Trotskyism in the United States. And he made extensive use of the materials here. We get research requests from historians in Europe and elsewhere trying to document the history of Trotskyism and Marxism in different places. We just got a request, for example, about the relationship between Trotskyism in the United States and Scandinavia, for example.
Very interesting. Quite niche also.
Yes, yes.
And is that something that we are able to help this person with?
Well, we're still investigating it,
Yeah.
but we do have, I would argue, probably one of the most extensive collections of materials on the history of Trotskyism in the United States. There are several libraries that have materials and papers of people, but I think what we're especially strong in is the internal materials of the Trotskyist movement. And so what we often have that's useful to researchers is material on debates and discussions, not just publications, which you could find online. And so what we're trying to do is go through the meetings and go through the discussions and then help this person.
Very interesting. So I think that brings a number of questions to mind. I'll kind of ask them in succession. So first is, I think especially for some people on the left, I think it's quite interesting to be like, oh, James Robertson's, initial collection of that, and then the Central Committee of the SLUS and so on. I think that's quite interesting. But could you give us a little bit of a sense of like what led to the decision to actually turn this into a real institution that would be open to the broader public?
Well, I mean, I think that it comes from a vision that these are questions that we deal with and materials that we have are of interest to the broader left and the labor movement, the workers' movement, the Marxist left in general. And that, especially in the period that we're in now, I think it's important that they get hashed out. So some of the things that we have, for example, the papers of Richard Frazier. Richard Frazier was a veteran American Trotskyist. He was active in the Socialist Workers' Party for many decades. He was active in lots of things, but his key area was looking at the role of Black oppression in American capitalism and also the need for the Marxist left socialists to fight for Black liberation as part of the fight for socialism. So he has documents and histories of the country and the role of slavery in the development of the country, and things that the questions obviously are different now, but it would be very useful. Another thing we have is the papers of the Red Flag Union, which was a gay liberation group that fused with the Spartacus League. But there are debates and discussions about the role of gay oppression, the role of gender, stuff that I think are still being debated and discussed in the left in this country and internationally. And so one of our goals is to make this available as a way of kind of hashing out programmatic clarity and understanding the world with, as Mark said, the point is to change it.
I mean, you've already started kind of inching towards it in terms of going towards some of our collections. Why don't we talk a little bit about that in terms of, I guess, I've done a tour of the PRL a couple of times, but, if I'm honest, I'm still quite intimidated by like how to navigate my way around and like where to find what. I guess a couple of things. So what are some of our like really interesting collections that are really worth a visit, but also the process of like acquiring certain material and how does that what's that like and so on.
Okay, I mean, one of the key things is we are not an antiquarian society. So you'll find sometimes archivists or collectors put a big focus on having a original document or something that Trotsky touched, which is cool, obviously, but that's not our goals. We accrue our stuff in various ways, but for us, a Xerox or a copy is oftentimes just as good as an original material.
Yes.
We try to get our stuff, like I said, we collaborate with other archives and other tendencies, and we get our materials from a variety of places. So just to give you some examples, some of our comrades went down in several decades ago to Mexico City, and where Trotsky had lived, and went through materials that had been left in his house that I understand was in a complete disarray, helped organize, but also take copies, not originals, but copies. And that's one of the bases of what we have.
Is this in the process of turning that into a museum?
Well, the Trotsky House in Mexico City is already a museum. Now it's actually owned by the Mexican government. And if you're in Mexico City, I recommend visiting it. Yeah. But at the time, it was kind of in complete disarray.
So we were able to actually look through some of the stuff that was kind of just, in this disarray.
Yeah.
And this was in English and...
Well, it's in different languages. Some of it was in English, some of it was, I think, in German, in French, the different languages. Some of it, I believe, was in Russian, the different languages of the Fourth International and the Trotskyist movement.
That is very, very unique. And like thinking about, I assume that much of this was written by Trotsky himself. Mm-hmm. So, there's the complete work of Trotsky, et cetera, et cetera. Is this something that we would also find in there, or is this kind of
some material is some of it's separate, some of it's also discussions that the Fourth International Trotsky had with his followers. The writings of Trotsky are pretty, the French especially are very extensive, and then the English have a lot of stuff, but I don't think that they're exhaustive. Mm-hmm. And then also one of our focuses is not just on the winners in debates, but also the different sides and different things, because we really believe that in order to come to grips, to understand with the history of the left, is to go through the discussions as they happen. So we put a big premium on internal materials. So the Trotsky materials would be one example. Another one is we have a lot of what we sometimes refer to as the Goldwater papers, because there was a book dealer, Walter Goldwater, in Lower Manhattan, and at a time in World War II, followers of Max Shachtman deposited various materials with him, mm-hmm. and then never picked them up, and we acquired them later. And this gives us a very detailed view of debates within the American Trotskyist movement.
Very interesting. And I would imagine, kind of as a rule, just knowing my own personal ignorance, being Anglophone Trotskyist in the West, this is the stuff that's new to me. Mm-hmm. Right. So I assume that's the case with a lot others. Okay. In that vein, talk about internal documents of different organizations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would say that two really strengths of our documents, of our collection, we documentary records of the two different sides of the American Trotskyist movement. One of them would be the Communist League of America, the CLA, and then the Socialist Workers' Party. Pretty much, I believe, all the internal bulletins from 1928, I believe, up until the 1970s, as well as other internal material, including minutes of leading bodies, of correspondence. And it's a good way to get a sense of the questions that were being debated. For example, in the 1960s, debates over how to approach the civil rights movement, the question of the labor movement in the 90s. So that's one of our key collections. Another collection is the so-called Shackmanite tradition, because there is a split in the American Trotskyism in the late 1930s, early 1940s over the question of the Soviet Union. And so we have an extensive collection of materials. The so-called Workers' Party, which was Max Shachtman's organization, the Shackmanite Youth. And I think it's probably one of the biggest collections of such material in probably the world, but I would say also in the United States.
And again, just going back to how we came about to have this, is this through James Robertson's initial? Because I know he obviously came out of the RT and so on. So how we managed to accrue all of these?
I think that the core of it comes from Jim's papers and his own efforts himself, but then we've accrued in different ways, including correspondence and working with people who are active in the movement. We've gotten documents from, for example, copies from the Trotsky papers that are up at Harvard, or Hal Draper's papers in University of California. I mean, it's kind of assembled these from different places. So in that sense, I think it also gives a better sense than any one partial collection.
Yeah, because as you were speaking, I was just starting to think, like, yeah, there are these kind of really prestigious archives, in some of these Ivy League universities, when you have to kind of go all over the place. But I think that it sounds quite invaluable to have access to the different materials all in one space. And not just that, but then to have like kind of, we'll get to this, but like the people who lead the PRL and their own role in facilitating this work. I wondered if, unless there's some other material from the US, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the international Marxist movement and what we have to offer there.
Yes. I think that actually one of the key elements, or one of the gems of the collection, as it were, is our Russian language material, which we got largely through the efforts of our comrades who visited or worked in Moscow starting in the 1990s, including our late comrade Viktor Granovsky. But we have extensive material on the history of both the Bolshevik and socialist movement through 1917, and then the history of the left opposition afterwards. Victor, one of the things that he and others did is, after the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, and there was a tendency to destroy a lot of this material, actually pulled it together.
As I understand, in quite unique ways.
Yes. Including trying to get it into the United States. When we were bringing it in from Moscow, the border guards asked, "What is this?" And in his kind of unique way, Victor said, "Well, it's material aid for the working class of the United States, for the people in the South Bronx." And they said, "Okay, comrade, there you go." And so, I think that for people who are able to read Russian and are interested, I believe that we have probably one of the strongest such collections, certainly outside of Russia. And obviously, it's not that easy to get to Russia for people in the West these days.
Especially these days.
Yes.
Okay, very interesting. Other parts of the world?
Yeah, we have smaller but important collections. We have, for example, materials from the Mexican Trotskyist journal Clave from the 90s. When Trotsky was in exile in Mexico City, there was their journal, and it deals as Spanish language publications by Trotsky, but also kind of dealing with Mexican reality, Latin America. We also have collections on discussions in the French Trotskyist movement in the post-World War II period. We have collections on India. We have collections on Germany. A lot of it is aimed specifically at the Marxists, and specifically the Trotskyist movement. But people who are interested on this history, I think that it's definitely worth getting in touch or looking at what we have.
Absolutely. Okay, so as you mentioned at the start, PRL grew out of the initial library of James Robertson, and then it was the Central Committee of the SLUS. That was it was its library and so on. So how does that fact reflect itself in terms of what the holdings look like?
Well, I think it reflects itself in at least two different ways. One is the material that we have reflects first the interests of Jim, but then the broader interests of the party. We have a lot of books on the history of the Soviet Union, on the fight for Black liberation, and these reflects the concerns of the party in discussions. I think more fundamentally, it is reflected in our archival holdings, which are very deep in the history of the party and its activities. So, one of something that we've processed recently and we're working on are the archives of Jim himself. We have more than 40 archival boxes that document everything from his early political activity around the Communist Party in the 1940s, his activity in the Shachtmanites in the 1950s, and his work in the fusing with the SWP, and then, of course, the development of the SL and the ICL. And so there's extensive correspondence, reports, newspaper clippings about things such as the labor movement, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, correspondence with the Deacons for Defense. And so I think it'd be a great source to understand the development of the left in the United States and internationally in this period. Speaking as a professional historian, I think that somebody a graduate student, for example, looking for a dissertation topic might find something that's really valuable. And like any archives, you find kind of gems as you go through the material.
Absolutely. Coming back, I think a little bit to today, that's the archival side of it, because as a library, we also have books and books on new issues and things that are still developing and, well, whatever, new research, right? So we have lots of books, but at the end of the day, there's a physical limit to the amount of books you can put in a building. So I guess my question to you is, what kind of criteria does the PRL use to acquire new holdings?
That's a good question. And obviously there are realities of we don't have all the space in the world for everything that might be interesting. So I think that there are several different types of books that we have. One of them are Marxist classics. We try to acquire anything that comes out, and then also history of the Marxist and Trotskyist movement when there are new materials. We have especially documentary materials on, for example, the history of the Comintern. One of the key things people might remember several years ago, John Riddell published an English translation of the first four congresses of the Comintern, and that is something we were very excited to have. Other things reflect kind of the interests of the party, and one of the things is we're now focusing more and more on the global South and the fight against imperialism. So one of the things we've started here is getting more books on the history of Puerto Rico, particularly the labor movement and the left and the struggle against imperialism, U.S. imperialism in Puerto Rico, something that obviously here, Jose Marti called New York City the belly of the beast.
Right.
And that's kind of important as communists here in the United States.
Yeah, I'm really glad you actually mentioned that because, yes, it's the party's interest. We are affecting a turn towards the global South and so on. But it's not so much, for the fact of, oh, well, now we're interested, so we'll have books, right? But it's a conscious political choice on our part to try and deepen our understanding of these societies to the end that we can actually extend ourselves there, right? And I think, acquiring more books on Puerto Rico, for example, is part of a process of a political orientation to be able to, do communist work in Puerto Rico, right? I think in that sense, PRL is quite unique in that, it's not a typical library that just has books for the sake of having books, but that really is, there's a certain synergy between, on the one hand, PRL is open to the broader, labor movement to come and do its work. But at the same time, there's a synergy between what the PRL does and how it seeks to aid the organization in achieving its political kind of perspectives.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on both both sides of that. On the one hand, we are open to everybody. We can talk about that bit about how we encourage people to come. But in terms of developing our collections and kind of our overall purpose, it is to guide the fight for socialism, and that requires understanding different societies. So some things I just find interesting, but the overarching goal is, we have books on the history of the labor movement in Puerto Rico, but that's because the working class in Puerto Rico, we believe, is a key aspect, will be and should be a key aspect in the fight against U.S. imperialism there. And so that's kind of an example of where our holdings reflect our political purpose.
Yeah. I think something you just said, it's like a library that aids in the fight for socialism. I think that's really what the PRL is, and that's what its main aim is, and that's why it's interesting. I'm talking a little bit about the less the archival, less the holdings, but the day-to-day work. So as I said at the outset, you are a research associate here. What does that mean? And what does your work with the PRL look like? Are there other staff, etc.? What do you guys do with the PRL?
Yes, there are several other comrades who work at the PRL. But a lot of our work is on a day-to-day level, maintaining, organizing our collections, deciding what we want to get, processing it. One of the key things is kind of preserving the materials that we have, and kind of carrying out political discussions about what we read. There's a lot of work, but one of the benefits, I think, of doing work in a library is that it hopefully gives us the chance to read and discuss these things.
Absolutely. I think the other side of this is, so as a physical space itself, we've, I think, spent the better part of, 20 minutes or so talking about why it's interesting, why it's useful, why it's important. Now, say I'm listening to this and I'm like, oh, yes, I will go to the PRL. What kind of access does somebody have to PRL?
Well, if you are in the New York metropolitan area, we are very interested in visitors, and we'd like to invite people to come and look at what we have. Unfortunately, we're not the New York Public Library, although I like to think that now we're easier to get into than the Columbia University Library.
Right. Good.
So reach out to us. Our email address is library@prl.org. We're also on Twitter at PRL_library. And let us know what you're interested in, what you're researching, or just what in general you want to find or what you're looking for. And we endeavor we'll be happy to try to arrange a tour to make it possible to come and to visit us. If you're outside of the New York metropolitan area, as I mentioned earlier, we're more than happy to correspond by email, and to the extent we can, to send scans or to let you know what archival holdings we have and what might be useful.
Sounds like a pretty snazzy deal.
I like to think so.
Okay, cool. So I think I've run out of questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
No, except again, just to encourage people to reach out. We have a lot of stuff that people who are discussing the struggle for workers' power, the fight against imperialism, fight for women's liberation. I think there's a lot of stuff that will be crucial in the struggles that will be coming in the future. And just to let us know what you're interested in, and we'll try to set something up.
I think what that, this juncture today in the world, like we're just bombarded with absolute mess of information. Much of it, I think, is very, very impressionist. You are blown by the wind, whichever direction it's taking you. What's happening with Trump? Is it fascism? Is it this? Is the US drifting from Europe? Like all of these questions, I think, if anything, conscious young leftists, people who are really trying to make sense of it, it's actually all the more necessary to, I'm not saying go bury your head in books, but actually having a better sense of the history of the Marxist movement, having a bit of depth, actually is key to being able to orient ourselves today.
I definitely agree. I don't think that people should bury their head in books, but I think that if you don't read about the history and understand Marxism as a theoretical and scientific movement, it's oftentimes you get blown in the wind, like you said. So I think that the PRL will help anchor you in forging struggles that go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, thanks, Jacob, for spending your time with us.
Thank you. Thank you.